Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary Podcast is for you.
Hello and welcome to episode 234 of the Spybrary Podcast. Today, we are talking all about an action-packed espionage thriller written by former number 10 Downing Street foreign policy advisor and former UK ambassador to Lebanon, Tom Fletcher. The book is called The Assassin. Welcome to Spybrary, Tom.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
So before we dig into the book, I'm really curious about your writing journey. Could you share with our listeners who you are and how you found your path to becoming an espionage thriller writer?
Well, it's a fair question because I never expected to be here, really. I'm a diplomat. I'm a recovering ambassador. And I spent 4 years in number 10 Downing Street. I worked for Blair, Brown, and Cameron. And they decided that if I could survive that roller coaster ride and dealing with intelligence at the very center of government and foreign policy at the very center of the very heart of the administration, then I could maybe survive Lebanon. And so they sent me out to Beirut. The Arab Spring was just beginning. The Syrian civil war ended up dominating my time there, dealing obviously with many of these issues really close up as we evacuated the team from Damascus, dealt with explosions, hostage situations, terrorist threats, and so on. So I really lived many of the stories which I've then come to write about. And then I was writing nonfiction. I wrote The Naked Diplomat and 10 Survival Skills for a World in Flux. And I went to my agent, brilliant guy called Ed Victor, and said, what shall I write next? And he said, I know what you should write. You need to write a spy novel. And I said, Ed, have you got me confused with, maybe there's the other Tom Fletcher, the guy who's a singer in the band, is there someone else you're thinking of? He said, no, this is what you're meant to be doing. And I couldn't really understand it. But what he meant was that it was a way of writing about these things I could never otherwise write about, of lifting the curtain on what it's really like to be inside an embassy, dealing with these crises as they're happening. And Ed was spot on. And then very sadly, just a few weeks later, Ed died. And I'd been thinking, I'm never going to write this book. And then I thought, okay, this was the last thing he said to me. And so I got on with it and wrote the book. I went to Umbria for 3 weeks and lived in this castle with a bunch of other writers and wrote the first draft of The Ambassador in one go.
Brilliant. So what was it about? Obviously, you've got your work as a diplomat and being a foreign policy advisor, but were you a reader of spy thriller fiction?
Yeah. So everyone who works in diplomacy sort of likes the fact that people think we're spies, just as everyone who works in espionage pretends to be a diplomat. So there's a kind of crossover. And of course, in embassies and in number 10 and in my previous role, you work very, very closely with people, really out there doing this extraordinary work. So every diplomat ends up reading spy novels. There aren't many novels about diplomats, and embassies. Yeah. So the closest thing we get is espionage. And I suppose the big one for me was Le Carré. And I used to show, when Le Carré was out, when David Cornwell was out in Kenya, researching the book he set there, I actually drove around with him. I took him around Kenya, showing him locations and observed him close up and the way that he collected characters, collected plot, collected dialogue. And maybe that was the moment when I got this sort of, first glimmer of excitement about what it would mean to find amazing characters and just put them in amazing situations, in amazing locations, and see what happens.
And to my knowledge, that's something AI can't do yet. So
it really can't.
There's this big worry. Mm-hmm.
It really can't. And, I'm just teaching a course at the moment at Oxford University, which is in my day job as I run an Oxford college. And it's called Head, Hand and Heartford, because we're trying to teach people the life skills that AI can't do. How do you coexist with the machines? How do you ensure that the tech works for you and you don't work for the tech? And ultimately, this creativity, what in diplomacy we call the last 3 feet between two humans, that emotional intelligence. People call those things 21st century skills. I call them diplomacy. And no, the AI won't replace them for, well, I hope not in my lifetime, certainly not in my working life.
Absolutely. So The Assassin is the second book in this series. The question that my community were asking is, should we read your first book first, The Ambassador, and then The Assassin, or can The Assassin be picked up and read as a standalone?
So I'd love everyone to read both. And there are, there are common characters. The lead character, Ed Barnes, the ambassador who goes rogue, is obviously a common character. People who've read The Ambassador already, I don't want any spoilers, but you may find an old friend from there returning as well, who we were worried might have disappeared from the plot. So I'm very glad that he's back, tearing around, getting up to his usual mischief. I think there is a continuity between the two, but you don't have to have read The Ambassador. The Assassin is a self-standing book as well. It's set in a different country, different countries, and in a different context, and looking at a different ethical theme, really. Underlying it all, in between all the murder and all the crises and hostage situations, and the assassinations and so on, the great theme of the second one is, what does it mean to be a good ancestor?
Can you expand on that?
So I've thought a lot about this.
The spoiler territory, of course.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this. And if, I'm a father now, but also, looking at my relationship with my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents, what are the things that we must do for future generations? What must we leave behind? What must we not leave behind? And if one of the great challenges our kids and our grandkids are going to face is climate change, and if that's going to put them at great personal risk, what are the ethics around who it would be okay to assassinate to stop that happening? And that is a core theme of The Assassin. Is it acceptable? If you're, as one of my characters is, a head of the special forces, an SAS commander, and people are telling you all the time to go out and kill for your country and telling you who to kill, what if you were to choose 12 people to assassinate yourself because of the damage they were doing to your descendants? I think that's a quite interesting ethical dilemma to be in, and that's what confronts Ed Barnes as our ambassador in The Assassin. He's someone who's, apart from going off-piste in The Ambassador, has trodden a fairly kind of traditional centre ground path. He's a classic kind of centrist dad, if you like. He's all about tolerance and moderation and negotiation and diplomacy. And in The Ambassador, he had to go seriously off-piste in order to solve a murder that had happened in his embassy in the Paris embassy. And in The Assassin, he has to go further off-piste because it really takes into the heart of what it means to be a human and to be a good ancestor, and whether actually that means sometimes you have to kill for your beliefs.
Yeah, the kind of dilemma in the spy genre is alive and well there. So what was the spark or inspiration for the sequel and for this book?
I think in a way, the real nemesis of this book is Donald Trump. And a lot of my writing has really been about the danger of a world that is run by people like Putin and Trump, a world that takes you to the extremes, a world of polarization and extremism. And so many of my villains in The Ambassador were people who were pushing us in that direction. And I suppose the logical extension of that is what's going on in The Assassin. And, ultimately, would you even need to consider killing one day the American president if the American president was also one of the people who was putting your descendants at risk? So I think it's that political context that we're living in at the moment, and that we've been living in for the last 7 or 8 years of polarization and extremism. And can the centre fight back? Yeah. And the centre probably thought it could fight back through words and values and politics and liberal democracy. I just did a BBC documentary recently on how do we fight for liberal democracy. And the book's an extension of that. It's actually looking specifically at, can we fight? Do we have to be much more muscular, much more robust in fighting for these values? And what will that mean for the sacrifices we ourselves must make?
Could you walk us through the opening scene of the book, so setting the stage for our listeners?
So it's a bit different to The Ambassador. The Ambassador starts in a glitzy embassy reception, with the champagne and canapes in Paris and the glamour of all of that. This one actually starts at the High Commission in Nairobi, where our main man, Ambassador Ed Barnes, has been sent as High Commissioner, having really gone off-piste in the Ambassador. But the very, very first scene is actually a scene of a poaching incident, and you have someone out there trying to kill one of the last rhinos in the Masai Mara, and it takes you into the mindset of a poacher and his desire for the hunt and the kill and the wait you go through, the satisfaction of waiting for the moment when you pull the trigger and end this life. And then, just as he is about to do that, our assassin pops up and effectively, literally turns the gun around and puts him through that same process, but this time with the poacher as the victim. And without any spoilers, I think it's fair to say the poacher doesn't come off too well at the end of that. And this is our first ethical dilemma. You know, who's the bad guy in that situation? For me, it's probably not the assassin. And so I hope that from the beginning, the reader is slightly on the side of the person who's meant to be the bad guy in the book.
Yeah, that's very intriguing as an opener. And I asked that because recently in our online community, you know, I asked our listeners, you know, if you walked into a bookshop, you don't know any of the authors, you know, what do you decide? What are the factors in buying that book? And of course, plot, location, setting. But quite a few of our listeners said, oh, we'll read the first few pages, check out the writing style, but also, you know, how is it drawing me in? And every author has a different style. So I imagine I'm very intrigued now about the poaching scene. It's very different.
And it's, you know, it's special to me as well because, you know, as with the first one set beginning in the embassy in Paris where I used to work at the High Commission in Nairobi. And so, you know, for me, it's a world I know well and a world I care about. And given that the book is ultimately about saving the planet from climate change, it seems fitting to begin it with the murder or the attempted murder of an animal and then the very real murder of a human.
No, I love that. That's very different. I'm excited to read that for myself. You had a wonderful endorsement from Frederick Forsyth, who actually wrote, as one long convinced the truth is very often stranger than fiction, I enjoy Tom Fletcher's debut novel, The Ambassador. The author can draw authenticity from a career spent at the coalface of diplomacy and intelligence, which is why it's a page turner. How do you feel about getting such a... I mean, he's not even been on Spybrary yet, Freddie. We've got it in the works. I don't know when it's going to happen, but that's a huge endorsement for you.
Wow, it is. I mean, I was chuffed to bits to get that, and also to get the one from Andy McNabb as well, whose books I've obviously also loved. I think, you know, when you're in the world I was in, being an ambassador, working in Number 10, working around real spies, you meet a lot of authors and a lot of writers, and they're all looking for the authentic. They're all looking for what is it really like. It's what John le Carre used to ask me when I met him, you know, what really happens behind the curtain. And they're all looking for that sort of magic around, you know, the authenticity. And so it's special then when they recognize it in the writing and they can understand that it does come from the fact that you have been there in the room as this stuff's happened. You know, I was just talking to the students just now about, you know, the time one of my bodyguards saved my life in Kenya when, you know, I had an assassin come and try to take me out. And so in the book, when I'm writing about how these assassinations happen and why and the reality of being in that situation, you know, it's something I know. The letter in the first book, in The Ambassador, that one of the key characters writes their son when they think they're about to die, is a letter that I wrote my own kids when I was facing assassination threats myself. So I hope I can bring that authenticity from real lived experience. And I'm just chuffed to bits that Freddie and Andy McNabb and others have seen that.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking of your work as an ambassador, something that often comes up in spy fiction is you have the hardworking ambassador of an embassy, usually US or UK, and then you have the MI6 or the CIA case officer who normally becomes in spy fiction anyway, a pain in the backside for the ambassador, and there's normally quite a tense relationship. Was that your experience, or was that just the realms of spy fiction?
Well, there's sometimes, I mean, basically you have the same objectives and you're working pretty closely together. It's normally quite a small team, and you know, so you tend to get along pretty well. I think the ambassador is always very careful not to ask all the detail of what's going on, because there has to be, you know, of course, there have to be elements, compartments that are closed, even to the person at the head of the operation. But the ambassador has to set the overall strategy and has to know that whatever's going on is within that strategy. I mean, in my first book, in The Ambassador, actually, the Special Forces guy, who's modeled on a great friend of mine who used to run the Special Forces in the UK, ends up being his great comrade and ally and friend. And, you know, it's not too much of a spoiler, but is a key part of keeping him alive in some pretty nasty scrapes. And that really reflects my experience, actually, of working with these guys, who do more lethal work than we do as ambassadors. That, they are great people. They are great public servants, very, very loyal, incredibly loyal, and terrific comrades and allies.
Brilliant. Let's talk about the protagonist, because every protagonist has something special about them, something that makes us as readers root for them. Talking about your main character, how did he come to you, and what do you think makes him stand out in a crowded field of spy or thriller heroes?
So in a way, I've got two main characters. I mean, the first one, and I suppose the main protagonist is Ambassador Ed Barnes, and he is a kind of mixture of so many different ambassadors that I've met, who are brilliant communicators. They're great hosts. They're great diplomats. They're very smooth and very charming. But they get to a point in life where they start to think, what's all this really about? What are all these good relations for? And in the case of Ed, it takes some pretty rough things happening to him, including a murder in his embassy and all sorts of stuff going wrong in his family life, to really confront him with, what do you really want to fight for, to make sacrifices for? And that's what sets him off, makes him kind of leave all that and go rogue and go after some pretty bad guys. But I suppose he's based on a number of different people. Of course, a lot of people say, is it sort of semi-autobiographical? Am I meant to be Ed Barnes? And I don't think I am. There are bits of me in his dialogue, and I suppose there's more of me in him than I realize myself. But no, he's very much based on this mixture of amazing people that I've worked with, real adventurous people, mischievous people. He's got real mischief to him. And then Max Crawford, the special forces guy, he again is a mixture of several, but he's that kind of more familiar character, this like renegade, mischievous general. And there was a moment when I invited General Sir Graham Lamb over here to talk to students, and he said, one of them said, "How do you negotiate?" And he said, "Well, what I do, the first thing I do is throw one man out the window, and then I say to the next man, are you going to negotiate?" And they normally negotiate. And I love the fact that those sorts of stories from real people. He used to turn up in my embassy in Beirut, and he'd actually come over the fence, and he'd just be sat there in the morning at my breakfast table. And I'd go, "Graham, how did you get here?" And he'd go, "I don't think much of your security guards." He'd just be there. He's an absolutely brilliant character. So there are elements, I have to admit, and I've admitted it to him. So I think it's safe within the confines of your community to say there are elements of Graham in this, in Max Crawford as well. Someone who has a superpower, which is the ability to use very targeted lethal force in support of the objectives of their country.
Yeah. What can you tell us about the villain of the piece?
So yeah, I mean, in the Assassin, the new one, there are actually several villains, because they're thinking, who are the people most responsible for climate change? And so you might, for example, think a very right-wing talk show host who's sort of talking up polarization or denying climate change, for example, or maybe the governments which are fueling the climate disaster, or maybe particular politicians, or maybe someone who runs a budget airline in a very cynical way. These would all become the villains of that piece. And so,
Got it.
If you've got an assassin who's really thinking about who to target, they're having that they're questioning themselves, who are the villains? If you can kill anyone, you've got the skills, you've got the means, you're anonymous, you can move in the shadows. Who would you choose to kill? Who are the bad guys in society today? And then ultimately, I think, there's a character in it who is the very, very dangerous US president, complete narcissist. Who might that be based on? Who is at, in the end, the person who can make or break a climate change deal? And I suppose that they are the ultimate villain.
What can you share with us about the locations of the novel?
So the first one, the ambassador kind of rampaged from Paris. It went to Copenhagen. It went all over the world. It actually came here to Oxford, where I'm interviewing from today. Went all over the world. The second one starts in Kenya, and it rattles along. It gets to Geneva at one point, another city that I know and love. It goes to Jordan, to the Dead Sea, and into the deserts of Jordan, the sort of empty quarter, and so on, and also to the US, where a lot of the key characters are based.
Excellent. I'm keen to know a little bit more about your writing process. We got a lot of budding writers that listen to the show. So you wrote the first book. Did your writing process or approach change for the second one?
Very much so. So the first one, as I said, was written really in a great kind of stream of consciousness in 3 weeks, living in this castle in Umbria. I then put it in a drawer for 2 years. Lost confidence in the process, and only got it out during the lockdowns, and then approached it really as more of an apprentice, and with a bit more humility, admitting that I didn't really know how spy books, thrillers worked, and then went away and properly studied thrillers, studied how you write plot and dialogue, all those things that, I'm sure your listeners, and I'm sure you would tell me I should have done at the very beginning. But that then shaped how I rewrote The Ambassador. And it was very useful then starting this book with that knowledge, with those extra tools. But ultimately, I think it is as simple as find some really interesting, extraordinary characters, put them in some surprising and dangerous situations, and then see what happens.
And when you say you studied the art of thriller writing, did you go on courses? Was it books, or was it your own personal curriculum where you read around the thriller genre and drew your own conclusions?
So in the lockdowns, I did a lot of YouTubing. And there's some brilliant stuff on there, as you'll know much better than I do, where people really take apart the craft of it. But ultimately, you had to go away and read the stuff. And I imagine that you and your listeners are actually the best people at actually writing this stuff, because you know it inside out. But that for me was, I think, as with anything, the best way to learn is by doing it and experiencing it. It's the practice, not just the theory. That was certainly the way I've always done my diplomacy, and it's the way I try and do my education work now as well.
Yeah. In terms of your books, so we often see, and particularly in the United States, maybe not so much in the UK, that there is a division in spy thriller of the actioneer end, right? Your Jack Ryan's, that type of character, and then your Le Carre's spy coming from the cold. Where would you place your work on that spectrum?
So there's a lot of action. There's actually a lot more action than I would have anticipated at first. When I first started writing The Ambassador, I thought it was really an ideas book. And it was about this sense of how do you fight for the center ground against the extremes? What are you prepared to sacrifice to do that? And then as I got into it, I realized that the real fun was in blowing stuff up and having people taken hostage and having people have to fight for their lives, and all those things that I'd seen close up and thought about a lot in that world of diplomacy and intelligence. And so I ended up doing a lot more of that. And I think, in a way, if anything, The Assassin has got probably twice as much blood and gore and murder and mayhem, and hopefully that's what people enjoy and come back to. In the background, I think there have to be ideas, and as I say, there is this basic idea about who would you kill on behalf of your descendants, which really animates all the drama and the bounce and the action. But the action is really good fun. So I think I'm moving towards more and more action.
Sure, got it. So obviously the book is quite political in terms of its theme with climate change, and you mentioned polarization. Do you fear that you might attract negative reviews or, the online trolls because you are making this about climate change?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a risk. I mean, it's a risk I'm very prepared to run, because it's a subject that I think really matters and that will matter more and more, and also one that matters particularly to young people. And hopefully there'll be an audience there who are thinking about these things in different ways. I also think it's quite interesting that actually my characters are not young. You've got an ambassador and a sort of special forces guy. They're people who might not be expected, wouldn't be expected to think about these things in the same way, and that they're at a point in their life where they've realized that much of what they've been doing doesn't really matter, and yet this really does. Now, I would definitely expect some kind of angry reviews. People who think, it's a sort of weird combination of justifying murder in a sort of slightly woke objective. I mean, that's a sort of odd combination of factors. So if you don't really like assassinations and you don't really like people banging on about climate change, then you probably will either love or hate this book. So it will divide people, but that's the fun of it, isn't it? I mean, that's the fun of writing in this way.
Absolutely. I mean,
I don't want to write something that's just kind of boring and that doesn't excite a reaction in people. I want there to be a reaction. I want people to enjoy it for what it is, but also to think about it as well. And so hopefully that's what we've done with The Assassin.
I feel a bit silly asking you if that negative reviews of that kind would affect you, because we were sharing before you came on air that you used to have 10 bodyguards. There's been assassination attempts on your life, and a review on Amazon. Will that hurt more? I don't know. I mean, it's a tough life for authors, right?
The best review. I mean, it was the worst review really, but my favorite review I ever got was for my first nonfiction book, The Naked Diplomat. And someone on Amazon has given it no stars. And they've said, I was very disappointed in this book. Ever since I was a young person, I've always wanted to look at photos of naked people doing diplomacy, of nude diplomats. And this one had no photos of nude diplomats at all. And so I was really disappointed.
Crikey. Okay. That's a funny world, isn't it?
So just, spoiler alert again, I'm afraid there are no pictures of naked diplomats in The Assassin either, or naked assassins. Everyone is pretty much fully clothed throughout, maybe apart from in a couple of slightly racy scenes.
Yeah, got it. What's next for you, Tom?
So, very excitingly, we're talking at the moment about making the Ambassador into a TV series, 6 or 8 part TV series. I'm not allowed to say too much about that, and obviously, as everyone tells me, many a slip between cup and lip. Many of these projects don't get off the drawing board, but there's genuine excitement in the people that I'm working with on it, and they are extraordinary, very, very gifted people who know their stuff. So I hope that will see the light of day in the next year and a half, and I'd be. If that happens, I'll be very closely involved in making it and putting it together. I would hope then, if the Ambassador gets made into one, then who knows? Hopefully, the Assassin gets the same treatment.
Definitely.
I'd want to write. I think it's a 3-part series. There's one more in this series to come. There are some loose ends that need tying up. There are some really interesting characters who've emerged from the background in the course of The Assassin, who I'd like to develop further and who could be foregrounded a bit more. And I want to know what happens to Ed Barnes next, and I don't know yet. So I'd love to get onto that. And in the meantime, look, I'm still doing diplomacy. I'm off literally doing some real diplomacy next week in a region that I used to live in and that I know a lot about and care a lot about, trying to help with efforts towards a peace process there. And I'm loving life running in Oxford College, and it's a massive privilege being around these young people and being energized by them and feeling their creativity and seeing how they see the world and helping them prepare for it.
Absolutely. Well, I think you were writing spy thrillers at the correct time. There is a resurgence in spy fiction. We're seeing a lot more. It's great that you keep getting commissioned for TV. There's been a lot of spy stuff that's come out in the last few years. It's been very successful. We see, myself, just the amount of quality spy books that are now being written means I can't keep up. And it's a nice problem to have. And I just got word that we're doing a book festival in Ealing. It's the inaugural Ealing Book Festival, and we're having a spy panel, and it sold out 60 seats. And this is 12 quid a pop, right? This is not you turn up and it's free. And now they're giving us a room for 120. And the panel is called Why Spies? And there is this fascination. And I think you hit the nail on the head earlier on. We want to know as a layperson, what is it like being in an embassy? What is it like being an ambassador? What is the spy world like? And we don't know what's true and what's not. And that's what makes it so thrilling for us. So I think you're coming at a good time. And also there was an article a couple of weeks ago in the Times written by one of our listeners and contributors, Tim Shipman, saying, the Americans were taking over the classic espionage mantle, because we're getting people like Paul Vittich, McCloskey, I.S. Berry coming in. So I'm glad that the likes of you, Tom, are flying the Union Jack for us and making sure that, British espionage is still alive and well.
Absolutely. But spies and diplomats have always lived very closely together. I said earlier on that, every spy pretends to be a diplomat in some way, and every diplomat kind of likes the idea they might be a spy. And that's always been the case, going back to the earliest diplomats. Queen Elizabeth I sent out diplomats to have a representational role, to basically stand in for her and project power on her behalf, but to also tell her what was going on in the other courts of Europe, to look behind the curtain and tell her the intrigues and who was up and who was down. So those two worlds have always been intertwined, and we probably end up reading and writing more about the spies in those worlds than about the diplomats. And it's been quite fun to bring those two things together, and hopefully to show that the diplomats in that equation are not just sort of slightly bumbling or sort of pompous, slightly kind of traditional characters, but are complex characters in themselves and very much part of the action, including, maybe not to the extent I've written it in The Assassin. I mean, that's kind of taking it to fresh lengths, but they are very much part of the action too.
Yeah. Is there anything we haven't asked you about your work that you wish we had?
Let me think. I think we're well covered, actually. We talked about Beirut and crises there and evacuations, and we've talked about Number 10 and intelligence gathering there and working for prime ministers. And I'll tell you one thing. I mean, so the first one had endorsements from a couple of prime ministers as well. I don't know if that's a kind of curiosity or not.
Yes, it is.
I mean, do you want to just tee that up and I can say what they were and say how,
I can edit that. Just go for it. I can edit that. Just go for it.
So, I mean, I was also thrilled that the ambassador and, the series with The Assassin as well has had great endorsements from people at the very top of UK politics. So Gordon Brown wrote very nice things about the first one, and David Cameron, who I also worked for in Number 10 as well, both of whom are avid readers. They both read massively, and they both enjoy reading spy thrillers. So that was pretty comforting to feel that people who've been at the very heart of, the very top of the pyramid, the intelligence pyramid, could also find scenes in these books which were sort of authentic. Of course, a lot of the action in the books does take place behind the black door of Number 10, where I worked for 4 years for those prime ministers. And so I've tried to bring to the reader a reality of what that world is like, and how politics and statecraft and intelligence interact and intersect as they come closer and closer to the very center of power.
Well, the goal of these interviews are to give our readers and our listeners a flavor of what your books are about. The best endorsement I can give you, Tom, as soon as we're done recording here, I'm off to order.
Yes.
I'm going to go back to the first one and then read the second.
Right.
And, if busy former prime ministers have got time to read your stuff, it must be good, Tom, because I can't imagine what their to-be-read piles are like.
Thank you.
Shea, Blair, and Brown, and Cameron.
I'm thrilled to hear that. And that's really kind. It's really kind of you to have me on as well. Because I'm an amateur in this world. I'm someone from different worlds. I'm from the world of diplomacy and now the world of education. And I often feel like a real imposter in the world of writers. And so it's very kind of you to let me kind of come and join the world of writers and the world of spy writers in this way. And I'm chuffed to bits to go onto the podcast.
Well, thank you to your hardworking colleague at Canelo, Kate. And I do have to give a shout out to Canelo. They're publishing some epic spy authors right now. You got Charles Beaumont, Spy Alone.
Brilliant.
Alex Gurlis' stuff is great. Now yours. So, well done, Canelo. I know it's a hard slog being a publisher. We truly appreciate it. We also appreciate you, Tom. Thanks ever so much for coming on Spybrary.
Great to see you. Many thanks again. All the best.